The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Downeyville, California, as Florence Daniels stood trembling on the auction block, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope that bit into her skin. The year was 1852, and the gold rush had transformed this Sierra Nevada mining town into a place where everything and everyone had a price. $5 for this one, the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the crowd of miners and townsfolk. Barely worth the clothes on her back. Sickly-looking thing, ain't she? But she can cook and clean, I'm told. Florence kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to look at the jeering faces below. At 22, she had already endured more suffering than most faced in a lifetime. Orphaned during the journey west, then indentured to a family who had abandoned her upon reaching California, she now stood to be sold to whoever would take her a fate worse than the starvation she had been trying to escape. $3, someone called out, followed by derisive laughter. $2.50, another voice shouted, triggering more cruel amusement. The auctioneer spat into the dust. Come now, gentlemen. Surely she's worth something to one of you lonely miners. Worthless, a drunken voice called out. Send her back east. Florence's cheeks burned with humiliation as tears threatened to spill. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't give them the satisfaction, but each word cut deeper than the last. From the back of the crowd, a tall figure moved forward. The gathering parted as Quentin Ingram made his way to the front, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. The cowboy's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he looked up at Florence, his eyes meeting hers for one electric moment. $100, he said, his deep voice silencing the crowd. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. Did I hear correctly, Mr. Ingram? You did. Quentin removed a leather pouch from his vest and counted out gold coins. $100 for the lady. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Florence stared down at the stranger, confusion and fear warring within her. The auctioneer quickly recovered, grinning broadly. Sold to Mr. Ingram for $100. As Florence was led down from the platform, Quentin stepped forward. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. His features were sharp, tanned by years under the California sun, with eyes the color of a summer sky. He smelled of leather, horses, and the open range, nothing like the stench of whiskey and desperation that clung to most men in Downeyville. Why would you pay so much? She whispered as the auctioneer cut her bonds. Quentin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he removed his duster and draped it gently over her shoulders. The unexpected kindness nearly broke her resolve not to cry. Miss, he said softly, so only she could hear. To them you might be worthless, but to me you're priceless. Florence didn't know what to make of these words or the man who spoke them, but as he led her away from the jeering crowd and toward his waiting horse, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. Quentin's ranch lay 5 miles outside of Downeyville, nestled in a valley with towering pines on one side and rolling meadows on the other. As they approached on horseback, Florence sitting awkwardly behind him, she could see a modest cabin with smoke rising from the chimney and a barn where several horses nickered at their approach. This is Silver Creek Ranch, Quentin said, breaking the long silence of their ride. It's not much, but it's mine. It's beautiful, Florence replied truthfully. After months of sleeping wherever she could find shelter, the simple homestead looked like paradise. An older woman emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face creased into a smile as they approached. Mrs. Wilkins, Quentin called out, dismounting and helping Florence down. This is Miss Florence Daniels. She'll be staying with us. The woman's kind eyes took in Florence's disheveled appearance without judgment. "Welcome, child. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread in the oven. Mrs. Wilkins is my housekeeper," Quentin explained. "She comes up from town 3 times a week." "Pleased to meet you, madam," Florence said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get you settled," Mrs. Wilkins said, ushering Florence toward the cabin. Once inside, Florence was struck by the simple orderliness of the place. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center of the main room, and bookshelves lined another wall surprising in a cowboy's home. "You can have the spare room," Quentin said, pointing to a door off the main living area. "Mrs. Wilkins will help you get comfortable. I have work to attend to." With that, he nodded politely and left, the door closing softly behind him. Florence turned to Mrs. Wilkins, confusion evident in her expression. "I don't understand. Why did he buy me if not to?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Mrs. Wilkins smiled knowingly. "Mr. Ingram is not like other men, Miss Florence. He's a gentleman through and through. When he told me he was heading into town this morning, I never expected him to return with a young lady, but I'm not surprised he couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer." "But what does he want from me?" Florence asked, the question that had been burning inside her since he'd placed his bid. "That's something you'll have to ask him, dear. Now, let's get you cleaned up and fed. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." As Florence soaked in a warm bath later that evening, the first she'd had since leaving the East, she tried to make sense of her situation. She had gone from being auctioned like cattle to sitting in a private room in a clean homestead in the span of hours. The whole thing seemed like a dream from which she would soon awake, finding herself back in the squalid mining camp where she'd been abandoned. After bathing, she put on a simple dress that Mrs. Wilkins had provided slightly too large but clean and whole, unlike the tattered garments she'd been wearing. When she emerged from her room, she found Quentin sitting at the table, a ledger open before him. He stood when she entered, a gesture of respect she hadn't expected. "Miss Daniels, I hope you're feeling better." "Yes, thank you, Mr. Ingram." She clasped her hands nervously. "I feel I should thank you properly for what you did today, but I'm not entirely sure what you expect in return." Quentin's expression remained unreadable. "I don't expect anything, Miss Daniels. What I saw happening in town today was wrong, and I had the means to stop it." "But $100 is a fortune," Florence protested. "Nobody pays that kind of money without wanting something." A hint of a smile touched Quentin's lips. "I suppose I do want something. I want to sleep at night knowing I didn't stand by while someone was being mistreated. That's worth more than gold to me." Florence studied his face, searching for any sign of deceit but finding none. "What happens now?" "Now, you eat, rest, and recover your strength." Quentin gestured to a bowl of stew Mrs. Wilkins had left warming by the fire. "Tomorrow, we can discuss your future. If you wish to leave for Sacramento or San Francisco, I'll provide funds for your journey. If you want to stay in Downeyville, I can help you find respectable work." "And if I wanted to stay here?" The words slipped out before Florence could stop them. Quentin looked momentarily surprised. "Here, at Silver Creek, I could cook and clean," Florence said quickly. "I'm a hard worker. I wouldn't be a burden." "This is no place for a young lady alone with a bachelor," Quentin said, his tone gentle but firm. "People would talk. People already think the worst of me," Florence replied, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "And Mrs. Wilkins is here often, isn't she?" Quentin considered this. "Let's not make any decisions tonight. You've been through enough today. Rest, and we'll speak in the morning." As Florence ate her stew, she couldn't help but steal glances at her rescuer. Quentin Ingram was different from any man she had ever encountered. There was a quiet dignity about him, a sense of purpose that went beyond the everyday struggle for survival that consumed most people in the gold country. Later, as she lay in the first real bed she'd had in months, listening to the night sounds of the Sierra Nevada wilderness through her open window, Florence realized she wasn't afraid. For the first time since leaving her home in Pennsylvania, she felt safe. The next morning, Florence woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was back in her family home in Philadelphia before the fever took her parents. Then, reality returned, and with it the memory of the auction block and the mysterious cowboy who had saved her. She dressed quickly and found Mrs. Wilkins in the kitchen, humming as she tended to breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Florence. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a long time," Florence admitted. "Where is Mr. Ingram?" "He's been up since before dawn, tending to the cattle. He'll be in shortly for breakfast." Mrs. Wilkins handed her a cup of coffee. "I've spoken with him about you staying on." Florence's heart skipped a beat. "You have? What did he say?" "He's considering it. Quentin Ingram is a cautious man, Miss Florence. He doesn't make decisions lightly." Mrs. Wilkins paused, giving Florence an appraising look. "Can you cook?" "Yes, my mother taught me before she passed." "Good. And sewing?" "I can mend and make simple garments." Mrs. Wilkins nodded approvingly. "That'll do. This place could use a woman's touch beyond what I can provide in my visits." "And Quentin needs—" She trailed off, seemingly thinking better of whatever she'd been about to say. "Needs what?" Florence prompted. "Someone to remind him there's more to life than work and duty," Mrs. Wilkins finished. "He's been alone too long." Before Florence could ask more questions, the door opened and Quentin entered, bringing with him the scent of morning air and horses. He removed his hat, nodding a greeting to both women. "Mr. Ingram," Florence said, gathering her courage, "I'd like to accept your offer of employment." Quentin paused in the act of hanging up his hat. "I don't recall making such an offer, Miss Daniels." "Perhaps not explicitly," she acknowledged. "But I need work, and from what Mrs. Wilkins tells me, you need help around the ranch. It seems a sensible arrangement." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Does it now?" "Yes," Florence said firmly, "and I promise I'll earn my keep." Quentin looked to Mrs. Wilkins, who gave him a subtle nod. "Very well, Miss Daniels. You may stay on a trial basis. I'll pay you a fair wage, and you'll have Sundays off to attend church in town if you wish." Relief flooded through Florence. "Thank you, Mr. Ingram. You won't regret it." "We'll see about that," he said, but there was no sternness in his tone. "Now, is that breakfast ready?" "I've got a busy day ahead." As they ate together at the table, Florence noticed how Quentin maintained a polite distance in his manners, in his conversation, and in the careful way he avoided looking at her directly for too long. She wondered about his story, about what had brought him to this remote ranch, and why a man so evidently decent remained unmarried. After breakfast, Quentin gave Florence a brief tour of the property, showing her the vegetable garden behind the house, the chicken coop, the smokehouse, and the corral where several horses grazed. "I've got 8 men working for me," he explained as they walked. "They've got a bunkhouse on the other side of the ranch. They won't bother you, but if any of them step out of line, you tell me immediately." "Are they good men?" Florence asked. "Hardworking and honest for the most part. They know I don't tolerate troublemakers." Quentin pointed to a distant ridge. "I've got 500 head of cattle grazing up in those hills. We'll drive them to Sacramento come fall." Florence tried to take it all in. "How did you come to have all this?" Quentin's expression softened slightly. "I came out in '49 like everyone else, chasing gold. Unlike most, I saw that the real fortune was in feeding the miners, not joining them. Started with 1 cow and a bull, built from there." "You must be very proud," Florence said. "It's not about pride. It's about building something that lasts." He glanced at her. What about you, Miss Daniels? What brought you west? Florence looked down at her hands. My parents died of cholera in Philadelphia. I had no family, no prospects. I answered an advertisement for a family seeking a governess for their journey west. They weren't honest about their intentions. Quentin's jaw tightened. The family that abandoned you, Florence nodded. Mr. Hargrove lost everything gambling in Sacramento. Mrs. Hargrove blamed me, said I was bad luck. They left me in Downeyville with nothing but the clothes I was wearing. And no one helped you. A few tried. A widow let me sleep in her kitchen for a while in exchange for work, but she died last month after that. Florence shrugged. I survived however I could until the sheriff decided I was causing trouble by begging and put me up for auction as an indentured servant. Anger flashed in Quentin's eyes. Sheriff Mills has always been more concerned with pleasing the wealthy miners than upholding justice. It doesn't matter now, Florence said quickly. Thanks to you, I have a chance to start again. Quentin studied her face. You're remarkably resilient, Miss Daniels. Please call me Florence, she said. And I'm not resilient by choice, Mr. Ingram, only by necessity. Quentin, he offered in return. If we're to work together, we should dispense with formalities when it's just us. Florence smiled, feeling as though she had won a small victory. Quentin, she repeated, liking the sound of it. Now, what would you like me to start with today? The days that followed established a rhythm to life at Silver Creek Ranch. Florence rose early to prepare breakfast, tended the garden, gathered eggs from the chickens, mended clothes, and prepared dinner for Quentin and lunch for the ranch hands. Mrs. Wilkins continued to visit, teaching Florence the particulars of running the household and offering companionship. Florence discovered she enjoyed the work. After months of uncertainty, the structured days and clear purpose brought comfort. She took pride in seeing the cabin grow cleaner and more organized under her care, in the way Quentin's shirts were now properly mended, and in the appreciative noises he made while eating her cooking. For his part, Quentin remained somewhat distant, though unfailingly polite. He spent long days working with his men, often returning after dark, tired and sometimes injured from the dangerous work of ranching. Florence learned to have hot water ready for him to wash up and to keep dinner warming by the fire. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Quentin returned with a gash on his forearm, the sleeve of his shirt soaked with blood. What happened? Florence gasped, hurrying to his side as he sat heavily at the table. Barbed wire, he said through gritted teeth. Careless mistake. Florence quickly gathered clean cloths, a basin of water, and the bottle of whiskey Quentin kept for medicinal purposes. Let me see it. He hesitated, then carefully rolled up his sleeve, revealing a nasty cut about 4 inches long. This needs stitching, Florence said, examining the wound. I can do it if you'll let me. Quentin looked surprised. You know how? My father was a doctor, she explained, already threading a needle she'd sterilized in the flame of a candle. I assisted him sometimes. Quentin nodded, then took a swig of whiskey before offering his arm. Go ahead. Florence worked carefully, cleaning the wound thoroughly before making neat, small stitches. Quentin didn't flinch, though she knew it must hurt terribly. His arm was muscular and tanned, with a scattering of old scars that told stories of a life lived hard. You have steady hands, he said, watching her work. My father said the same. Florence tied off the last stitch and began bandaging his arm. He wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but medicine wasn't a proper profession for a woman, according to my mother. What did you want? Quentin asked. The question caught Florence off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. I wanted to help people, she said after a moment, like my father did, but I also wanted a family of my own someday, children. You're young, you still can have those things. Florence smiled sadly. Perhaps. But life doesn't always give us what we want, does it? Their eyes met, and for a moment, Florence felt a connection deeper than employer and employee. There was understanding in Quentin's gaze, and something else, a loneliness that mirrored her own. The moment broke when he stood abruptly. "Thank you for tending to my arm. The stew smells good." "It's ready whenever you are," Florence said, busying herself with putting away the medical supplies to hide her flushed cheeks. That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship. Quentin began joining Florence for meals more regularly, and their conversations grew longer and more personal. She learned that he had come from Boston, that he had fought briefly in the Mexican-American War, and that he had a younger sister back east whom he hadn't seen in years. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about her father's medical practice among the poor, and about the dreams she'd had before circumstance forced her west. They discovered a shared love of reading, and in the evenings, they sometimes sat by the fire while Quentin read aloud from one of his books, Emerson, Thoreau, or sometimes Shakespeare. Summer deepened into a golden haze across the valley. Florence's skin bronzed from working in the garden, and her once bony frame filled out thanks to regular meals. She no longer jumped at sudden noises or flinched when someone moved too quickly near her, signs of healing that Quentin noticed but never mentioned. One Sunday in late July, Quentin surprised Florence by suggesting they ride into Downeyville together. "For church?" she asked, looking up from the bread dough she was kneading. "If you'd like," he said. "But also, I thought you might want to choose some fabric for new dresses. Mrs. Wilkins mentioned you've been making do with her hand-me-downs." Florence glanced down at her worn dress. "These are perfectly fine. You've earned your wages, Florence. It's time you spent some of them on yourself." The thought of returning to Downeyville made Florence anxious, but the prospect of new clothes was tempting. "Very well," she agreed. "I'd like that." They set out early, riding side by side on the trail to town. Florence had become a competent horsewoman over the past weeks, something Quentin had insisted upon. "A woman on a ranch needs to ride," he had told her, and patiently taught her on his gentlest mare, a dappled gray named Pepper. As they approached Downeyville, Florence felt her chest tighten. The last time she had been here, she had stood on the auction block, humiliated and terrified. Quentin, sensing her discomfort, moved his horse closer to hers. "We don't have to stay long," he said quietly. "No, it's all right," Florence replied, straightening her spine. "I won't let fear dictate my actions." Quentin's eyes crinkled with approval. "That's the spirit." Downeyville on a Sunday morning was relatively quiet, with most of the miners either sleeping off Saturday night's excesses or attending church services. As Quentin and Florence rode down the main street, a few people stopped to stare, and whispers followed in their wake. They dismounted in front of the general store, Quentin helping Florence down with strong, sure hands. The touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, and Florence felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with anxiety. Inside the store, Mrs. Peterson, the proprietor's wife, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "Mr. Ingram, how nice to see you. And Miss Daniels, isn't it?" "My, don't you look different?" Florence nodded politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson. We've come to look at fabrics, if you please." "Of course, right this way." Mrs. Peterson led them to a display of textiles. "We just got in some lovely calico from San Francisco. And there's a blue gingham that would suit your coloring." As Florence examined the fabrics, she was aware of Quentin standing nearby, hat in hand, watching her with an unreadable expression. She selected the blue gingham, a warm brown calico, and after much hesitation, a length of emerald green silk that cost more than she'd intended to spend. "The green will make a fine Sunday dress," Quentin commented as she fingered the luxurious material. "It's too extravagant," Florence protested. "Consider it a gift," he said, removing his wallet, "for all your hard work." Before Florence could argue further, the store door opened and a well-dressed couple entered. Florence recognized them immediately, the Hargroves, the family who had abandoned her. Mrs. Hargrove saw Florence first, and her pinched face registered shock, then disdain. "Well, if it isn't the troublesome governess. I heard you'd been sold off. Found yourself a protector, have you?" Florence felt as if she'd been doused with cold water. Quentin turned slowly, his expression darkening as he assessed the newcomers. "Mrs. Hargrove," Florence managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Hargrove." Mr. Hargrove, a portly man with a florid complexion, looked uncomfortable. "Come, Millicent, let's continue our business elsewhere." "I'm curious," Mrs. Hargrove continued, ignoring her husband. "Does Mr. Ingram know what kind of woman he's taken in?" "The sort who tries to seduce her employer's husband." Gasps came from Mrs. Peterson and another customer who had been browsing quietly. "That's a lie," Florence said, color draining from her face. "Is it?" Mrs. Hargrove sneered. "Henry, tell them how she threw herself at you." Mr. Hargrove tugged at his collar. "Now, Millicent, that's not exactly my recollection," Quentin interrupted, his voice cold as ice. "Is that you abandoned Miss Daniels without payment for her services, leaving her destitute in a mining town? That speaks more to your character than hers." Mrs. Hargrove drew herself up indignantly. "How dare you? Do you know who we are? My husband is a business associate of Mr. Stanford himself." "I don't care if he's an associate of President Fillmore," Quentin replied evenly. "You wronged this woman, and in my book, that makes you no better than common thieves." A tense silence fell over the store. Florence felt a surge of gratitude toward Quentin, even as she worried about the consequences of his words. The Hargroves were influential, and crossing them could cause problems. "We'll take the fabrics," Quentin said to Mrs. Peterson, effectively dismissing the Hargroves. "And we'll need thread, buttons, and whatever else Miss Daniels requires for her sewing." As Mrs. Peterson hurried to gather the items, Mrs. Hargrove made one last attempt. "You'll regret taking her side, Mr. Ingram. People will talk." Quentin turned to face her fully, his height and presence suddenly intimidating. "Let them. I know Miss Daniels' worth, even if you were too blind to see it." With that, he placed his hand gently on Florence's back, guiding her to the counter where Mrs. Peterson was tallying their purchases. The Hargroves left in a huff, the bell above the door jangling discordantly in their wake. "I'm sorry," Florence whispered as they waited. "I never thought we'd encounter them." "Don't apologize," Quentin said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. Their accusations mean nothing to me." His blue eyes were fierce with conviction. "I know who you are, Florence. I see you every day, your kindness, your diligence, your integrity. Nothing they say can change that." Florence felt tears prick her eyes at his unwavering faith in her. No one had ever defended her so vehemently before. They completed their purchases in silence, the earlier lightness of the day overshadowed by the unpleasant encounter. As they mounted their horses to leave town, Florence noticed more people watching them, whispering behind their hands. "They'll be talking about us now," she said as they rode past the church, where services were just ending. "Let them talk," Quentin replied, the same words he had said to Mrs. Hargrove. "Words can't hurt what we're building at Silver Creek." Florence glanced at him, wondering exactly what he meant by what we're building. Was it just a ranch, a business partnership, or something more? The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final hill before the valley opened up before them, Quentin reined in his horse. "Florence," he said, his voice softer than usual. What Mrs. Hargrove said about you trying to seduce her husband, Florence's heart sank. So he did have doubts after all. It wasn't true. Mr. Hargrove made advances that I rejected. Mrs. Hargrove found us when he was trying to impose himself on me. She chose to believe I had encouraged him. Quentin's expression hardened. If I ever see that man again, I may not be so restrained. It doesn't matter anymore, Florence said, touched by his protective anger. It matters to me, Quentin replied. Your honor matters to me. They looked at each other for a long moment, the summer breeze rustling the pines around them, the valley spread out below like a promise of safety and home. Thank you, Florence said simply. Quentin nodded, then nudged his horse forward. Come on, let's go home. Home. The word resonated within Florence as they descended into the valley. In just a few short weeks, Silver Creek Ranch had indeed become home in a way no place had been since her parents died. And the man riding beside her had become. What exactly? Her employer, certainly. Her protector, undoubtedly. But increasingly, he was becoming something more: a friend, a confidant, and perhaps, though she scarcely dared admit it even to herself, someone she was coming to care for deeply. August brought the hottest days of summer, when the air shimmered above the meadows, and the creek that gave the ranch its name dwindled to a sluggish trickle. The cattle grew restless, and the ranch hands worked from dawn until dusk, moving them to higher pastures where the grass remained green. Quentin spent less time at the house, often leaving before Florence woke and returning well after dark. When they did see each other, he was polite but distracted, his mind clearly occupied with the challenges of managing the ranch during the drought. Florence threw herself into her work, pickling vegetables from the garden for the winter months ahead, and sewing new dresses from the fabric they had purchased in town. She finished the green silk dress with particular care, adding delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs, a skill her mother had insisted she master. One evening in late August, Florence was sitting on the porch, enjoying the relative cool of the evening while darning one of Quentin's socks, when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw not Quentin but one of his ranch hands, a young man named Jake, riding hard toward the house. "Miss Daniels," he called, reining in his horse sharply. "Mr. Ingram's been hurt. He sent me to fetch you and medical supplies." Florence's heart lurched. "How badly is he hurt?" "Bull gored him in the side. He's bleeding pretty bad, but he's conscious. The boys are bringing him down from the north pasture now." Florence rushed inside, gathering bandages, alcohol, needle and thread, and the few medicines she had available. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as her mind raced with worry. By the time she returned to the porch with her supplies, she could see a group of riders approaching slowly, one man slumped in the saddle, supported by another rider. "Bring him in here," Florence directed as they reached the house. Two men helped Quentin dismount and half carried him inside, where they laid him on the kitchen table at Florence's instruction. "Everyone out except for Jake," Florence said firmly. "I need space to work." The men filed out, casting worried glances at their boss. Quentin lay pale and sweating on the table, his shirt torn and soaked with blood. "Not exactly how I planned to spend my evening," he managed to say, his attempt at humor undermined by the pain etched on his face. "Save your strength," Florence replied, cutting away his shirt to reveal a deep gash in his right side. The wound was about 6 inches long, jagged and dirty, but hadn't penetrated deep enough to damage vital organs from what she could tell. "Jake, I need hot water and clean towels," she instructed. "And light every lamp we have. I need to see clearly." As Jake hurried to comply, Florence examined the wound more closely. "You were lucky. Another inch deeper and we'd be having a very different conversation. Doesn't feel." "Lucky?" Quentin grunted. Florence gave him a stern look. "I need to clean this thoroughly. It's going to hurt. Do what you must." Florence worked methodically, first cleaning the wound with alcohol, which made Quentin hiss through his teeth but otherwise remain stoic. Then she picked out debris, dirt, fragments of cloth, even a small splinter of wood that must have come from the fence where he was gored. "Jake, hold his shoulders," she directed as she prepared to stitch the wound. The young ranch hand complied, looking queasy but determined. Florence took a deep breath and began sewing the gash closed with small, even stitches just as her father had taught her. Quentin's muscles tensed under her hands, but he didn't cry out or move away from her ministrations. "Almost done," she murmured as she tied off the final stitch. "You're doing well." When the wound was closed and bandaged, Florence mixed a dose of laudanum in water. "Drink this. It will help with the pain and let you sleep." Quentin grimaced but drank the bitter medicine without complaint. "Thank you, Florence." "Let's get him to his bed," Florence said to Jake. "Can you manage?" Between them, they got Quentin to his bedroom, a sparely furnished room that Florence had only glimpsed in passing when cleaning. Once he was settled, Florence sent Jake to inform the other ranch hands that their boss would recover. Alone with Quentin, Florence pulled a chair beside his bed and prepared for a long night of watching for fever or bleeding. "You don't have to stay," Quentin said, his voice already slurring slightly from the laudanum. "Of course I do," Florence replied, adjusting his covers. "You do the same for me." "Yes," he agreed, looking at her with unfocused eyes. "Yes, I would." He drifted off to sleep shortly after, leaving Florence to her vigil. As the night deepened around them, she studied his face, relaxed now in sleep in a way it never was when he was awake. The stern lines around his mouth softened, and he looked younger, more vulnerable. Florence realized with a start how much she had come to care for this man, not just as her employer or her savior from the auction block, but as Quentin himself. His quiet strength, his unwavering principles, his carefully concealed tenderness all had worked their way into her heart without her noticing. The realization was both sweet and frightening. Sweet because it had been so long since she had felt anything like affection for anyone. Frightening because she knew such feelings could only lead to heartbreak. Quentin was a successful rancher, respected in the community, despite his defense of her. He could have his pick of suitable women, not a penniless former governess with a questionable reputation. And yet, there had been moments the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice. The gentleness in his voice when they spoke in the evenings, the pride in his eyes when she mastered a new skill on the ranch. Could it be possible he felt something too? Florence shook off the thought. Now was not the time for such daydreams. Quentin needed her clear-headed and focused on his recovery, not lost in romantic fantasies. The night passed slowly. Florence dozed occasionally but woke at the slightest sound from Quentin. She checked his bandages, felt his forehead for fever, and gave him water when he roused enough to drink. Dawn was breaking when Quentin opened his eyes fully, his gaze clear and alert despite the pain that still creased his brow. "You're still here," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I told you I would be," Florence replied, setting aside the book she had been reading to pass the time. Quentin attempted to sit up, then winced and fell back against the pillows. "The bull is fine, according to Jake. Your men got him back in with the herd." Florence poured a glass of water. "Drink this. You need to replace the fluids you lost." Quentin complied, then looked at her more carefully. "You look exhausted." "Thank you for the compliment," Florence said dryly. A faint smile touched Quentin's lips. "I meant you should rest. I'll be fine now." "I will, after Mrs. Wilkins arrives." Florence stood, smoothing her wrinkled skirt. "I'll prepare some breakfast. You need to eat to regain your strength." As she turned to leave, Quentin caught her hand. "Florence." The touch sent a warm current up her arm. "Thank you, you may have saved my life." Florence squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing. "Consider it payment on my debt to you." "There is no debt between us," Quentin said seriously. "There never was." Florence nodded, not trusting herself to speak further, and left to prepare breakfast, her hand still tingling where he had touched it. Mrs. Wilkins arrived mid-morning, aghast at the news of Quentin's injury. She shooed Florence off to bed, promising to look after their patient. Florence slept deeply for several hours, waking in the afternoon to find the house quiet and a note from Mrs. Wilkins saying she had gone to town for more medical supplies, but would return the next day. Florence checked on Quentin and found him asleep, his breathing even and his color better than it had been. Relieved, she set about preparing a light supper, knowing he would need nourishing food to heal properly. When she returned to his room with a tray, Quentin was awake, staring out the window at the golden evening light on the distant mountains. "I brought soup," Florence said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Do you feel strong enough to sit up and eat? With help, perhaps," Quentin admitted. Florence carefully helped him into a sitting position, propping pillows behind him. The intimacy of the situation being in his bedroom, helping him in his weakened state, would have been scandalous in any other context, but seemed natural now, a necessary part of his care. "The soup smells good," Quentin said as she placed the tray across his lap. "You're spoiling me." "Hardly. This is basic care for an injured man." Florence sat in the chair beside his bed. "How is the pain? Manageable?" Quentin took a spoonful of soup. "This is delicious, thank you." They sat in companionable silence as he ate, the only sounds the clink of the spoon against the bowl and the distant lowing of cattle being brought in for the night. When Quentin had finished, Florence removed the tray and helped him lie back down. "Would you like me to read to you?" she offered. "It might help pass the time as you recover." "I'd like that," Quentin said. "There's a volume of Wordsworth on my shelf. My sister sent it from Boston last Christmas." Florence found the book and settled back in the chair, opening to a page marked with a pressed wildflower. "Is this a favorite passage?" Quentin nodded. "It reminds me of Silver Creek in spring." Florence began to read, her voice soft in the quiet room. As the light faded outside, she lit a lamp and continued, glancing up occasionally to find Quentin watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. After a while, she paused. "Am I boring you?" "Not at all," Quentin replied. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am, despite this injury." "Fortunate to be gored by a bull," Florence smiled. "Fortunate to have you here," he said simply. "When I first saw you on that auction block in Downeyville, I acted on instinct. I knew I couldn't leave you there, but I had no plan beyond that moment. I never imagined." "What?" Florence prompted when he didn't continue. Quentin's eyes held hers. "I never imagined you would become so essential to Silver Creek, to me." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "I'm glad I've been useful." "It's more than usefulness, Florence." Quentin's voice was earnest now. "You've brought life back to this place. Before you came, I was just existing, working, eating, sleeping, repeating the cycle endlessly. Now there's conversation, laughter, someone who notices when the wildflowers bloom or when the first snow falls on the mountains." "Quentin," Florence began, uncertain how to respond to such unexpected candor. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that whatever debt you think you owe me has been repaid 1,000 times over by your presence here." Florence set the book aside and leaned forward, gathering her courage. "What if I want to give more than just my presence?" Quentin's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I care for you," Florence said softly. "Not as an employee for her employer or even as a friend, though you are my dearest friend. I care for you as a woman cares for a man." The confession hung in the air between them, as fragile and precious as a soap bubble. Florence held her breath, suddenly terrified that she had misread everything, that she had destroyed the comfortable relationship they had built. "Florence," Quentin said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have no right to ask for your affection. You came here under duress, dependent on me for your safety and livelihood. It would be taking advantage." "No," Florence interrupted. "I'm not the desperate woman from the auction block anymore. I have skills, savings, options. If I wanted to leave Silver Creek tomorrow, I could make my way in Sacramento or San Francisco. I stay because I choose to. I care for you because I choose to." Quentin reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "I've been fighting my feelings for weeks, telling myself it was wrong, that you deserved better than a rough cowboy with more cattle than conversation." Florence smiled, turning her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. "And I've been telling myself that a successful rancher like you would never look twice at a woman with my history. Your history is what shaped you into the remarkable woman you are," Quentin said. "Brave enough to survive what would have broken many, kind despite the cruelty you've experienced, fiercely independent even when accepting help." Florence felt tears well in her eyes at his words. "No one has ever seen me so clearly before." "I saw you that first day in Downeyville," Quentin said, stroking his thumb across her knuckles. "Standing there with your head high despite everything. I knew then you were someone special. I just didn't know how special you would become to me." Florence couldn't speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Instead, she leaned forward and, with gentle care for his injured side, pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question as much as an answer. Quentin's free hand came up to cradle her cheek, his touch reverent as he returned the kiss with equal tenderness. When they parted, Florence rested her forehead against his, eyes closed, savoring the moment. "I never thought I could feel this way again," she whispered. "After everything, I thought that part of me had died." "We've both been given a second chance," Quentin said. "If you'll have me, Florence, I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret it." Florence opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "Is that a proposal, Quentin Ingram?" A smile spread across his face, transforming his usually serious expression into something boyishly charming. "It seems I'm going about this all backward. I haven't even courted you properly." "I think we're beyond conventional courtship," Florence laughed softly. "We've lived under the same roof for months. You've seen me at my worst, and I've literally stitched you back together." "Even so," Quentin said, suddenly serious. "You deserve to be properly wooed, not proposed to by an invalid who can't even get down on one knee." "Then get well," Florence said, pressing another quick kiss to his lips. "And ask me again when you can kneel properly. I'll pretend to be surprised." Quentin's recovery progressed steadily over the following weeks. Florence tended to his wound, changing bandages and checking for infection, while Mrs. Wilkins clucked and fussed around them both. The ranch hands managed the daily operations under Quentin's direction, coming to the house for instructions and reporting back on the state of the herd and the land. September brought cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color to the aspens on the hillsides. By mid-month, Quentin was able to move around the house and even venture onto the porch, where he spent hours watching the activities of the ranch with increasingly less patience for his confinement. "The doctor from Nevada City said another week before you can ride," Florence reminded him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. "The doctor is overly cautious," Quentin grumbled. "The cattle drive to Sacramento starts in 2 weeks. I need to be ready." Florence laid her hand on his arm. You won't be ready if you tear your stitches and end up bedridden again. Trust your men. They know what they're doing." Quentin covered her hand with his. Since that night in his bedroom, they had established a new closeness, holding hands, sharing kisses when they were alone, talking about future plans for the ranch and for themselves. They hadn't spoken again of marriage, both tacitly agreeing to wait until Quentin was fully recovered. "I do trust them," Quentin said, "but this is my responsibility." "Our responsibility," Florence corrected gently, "unless you've changed your mind about us." Quentin turned to look at her, his expression softening. "Never, you know that." "Then trust me when I say you need more time to heal." "I don't want to be a widow before I'm even a wife." The words slipped out naturally, and both of them smiled at the implication. "Speaking of which," Quentin said, reaching into his pocket, "I had Jake ride into town yesterday for supplies, and I asked him to stop at the jeweler's in Nevada City on his way back." He withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a gold ring set with a modest diamond flanked by 2 small sapphires. "It's not as grand as what you might have had in Philadelphia, but it's perfect," Florence interrupted, her eyes shining. "Absolutely perfect." Quentin took her hand. "Florence Daniels, when I first saw you, I said you were priceless to me." I didn't fully understand then what those words would come to mean. Now I do. Your courage, your kindness, your strength, they're beyond value. I love you, and I want to spend my life showing you just how precious you are. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Florence's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you, Quentin Ingram." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his healing wound. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepened with the promise of all that lay ahead for them. When they finally parted, Florence rested her head on Quentin's shoulder, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "When shall we be married?" "As soon as possible," Quentin said, his arm tightening around her. "After the cattle drive, perhaps early November. Unless you want a grand wedding that would take longer to arrange." Florence shook her head. "I don't need grandeur. Just you, me, a minister, and perhaps a few friends. Mrs. Wilkins would never forgive us if we didn't include her." "November it is, then," Quentin agreed, kissing the top of her head. They sat together as night fell completely, the vastness of the Sierra Nevada stars spreading above them like a blessing. Florence thought of all the twists and turns that had led her to this moment: the tragedy of losing her parents, the terrible journey west, the betrayal by the Hargroves, the humiliation of the auction block. From worthless to priceless in the span of a few months. It seemed impossible, and yet here she was, the weight of Quentin's ring on her finger anchoring her to this new reality. "What are you thinking about?" Quentin asked, noticing her contemplative silence. "About journeys," Florence replied, "and destinations. And how sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful places." Quentin's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as they had that first night when they confessed their feelings. "Welcome home, Florence," he said softly. "Welcome home." True to their plan, Quentin and Florence were married in early November, after the successful cattle drive to Sacramento had replenished the ranch's coffers and ensured their financial security for the winter ahead. The ceremony was held in the small church in Downeyville, with Mrs. Wilkins, the ranch hands, and a few friends from town in attendance. Florence wore her emerald green silk dress, finally completed with Mrs. Wilkins's help. Quentin, fully recovered from his injury, stood tall and proud in a new suit ordered from San Francisco. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady and sure, while Florence's trembled slightly with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and as Quentin kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the small congregation. The celebration afterward was held at Silver Creek Ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from the trees. There was music from a fiddle player Quentin had hired from Nevada City, dancing, and plenty of food and drink. Even Sheriff Mills attended, somewhat shamefaced in Florence's presence but eager to maintain good relations with one of the area's most successful ranchers. As evening fell, Florence found herself standing with Quentin at the edge of the celebration, watching their guests enjoy themselves. "Mrs. Ingram," Quentin said, testing the sound of her new name. "Are you happy?" Florence looked up at her husband, at the face that had become more dear to her than she could have imagined possible a few months ago. "Happier than I ever thought I could be," she said truthfully. Quentin's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. "I want to make you this happy every day for the rest of our lives. Just love me," Florence said simply. "That's all I need." "That," Quentin promised, "is something I can guarantee." As they rejoined their guests, Florence caught Mrs. Wilkins watching them with satisfaction. "I knew from the moment he brought you home that you were the one for him," the older woman said, patting Florence's hand. "He just needed time to see it himself." "I'm glad he did," Florence replied, her gaze following Quentin as he spoke with some of the ranch hands. "I can't imagine my life any other way now." The years that followed brought changes to Silver Creek Ranch. The small cabin was expanded into a proper house with multiple bedrooms, a larger kitchen, and a dedicated study for Quentin's growing collection of books. The herd increased, necessitating the purchase of adjacent land, and Quentin hired more men to help manage the expanding operation. Florence transformed from ranch housekeeper to ranch wife and partner, learning the business side of cattle ranching alongside her household duties. She also began offering basic medical care to the ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders, putting her father's teachings to use in a way that would have made him proud. In the spring of 1854, their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, after Florence's father. The birth was difficult, and for a few terrifying hours, Quentin feared he might lose both his wife and child. But Florence's strength prevailed, and when she finally held their son in her arms, the look of wonder on her face made all the fear worthwhile. "He has your eyes," she whispered to Quentin, who sat beside her on the bed, one arm protectively around her shoulders. "And your determination," Quentin replied, gently touching the infant's clenched fist. "He fought his way into this world just like his mother fights for everything that matters." Florence smiled tiredly. "We'll teach him that some things are worth fighting for, and that some people are priceless, even when the world calls them worthless." 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth, named for Quentin's sister back east, who finally made the journey west to meet her brother's family. Elizabeth Ingram was delighted with her namesake, and even more thrilled to see her serious, dutiful brother transformed into a loving husband and father. "You've built something remarkable here," she told Quentin as they watched Florence playing with Thomas while baby Elizabeth napped nearby. "Not just the ranch, but this family. I'm proud of you, brother." Quentin's expression softened as he gazed at his wife and son. "I got lucky. The day I saw Florence on that auction block was the most fortunate day of my life, though neither of us knew it then." As the children grew, so did the ranch's prosperity. Silver Creek became known throughout Northern California for its quality cattle and fair business practices. Quentin's reputation as a man of integrity spread, and he was often asked to help resolve disputes between miners and ranchers, or to serve on committees addressing the region's growing needs. Florence, too, earned respect beyond the boundaries of their land. Her medical knowledge, though informal, made her a valuable resource in a region where doctors were scarce. She delivered babies, set broken bones, treated fevers, and dispensed practical advice along with her remedies. What had begun as assistance to their ranch hands expanded to include anyone who sought her help, regardless of their ability to pay. "You should have been a doctor," Quentin told her one night after she returned from helping a neighboring family through a bout of influenza. "In another life, perhaps," Florence replied, settling beside him on the porch swing that had been his gift for their 5th anniversary. "In this one, I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 marked a turning point for the Ingram family. Though Downeyville was far enough from the epicenter to escape major damage, the catastrophe affected the entire state's economy and brought an influx of displaced people to the Sierra Nevada region. Quentin and Florence, by then in their late 50s with grown children of their own, opened Silver Creek to those in need. The ranch became a gathering place for families seeking to rebuild their lives, with Quentin offering work to those who needed it and Florence providing medical care and comfort. Thomas, who had followed in his father's footsteps as a rancher, worked alongside Quentin to accommodate the newcomers. Elizabeth, who had her mother's healing touch and had trained formally as a nurse in Sacramento, returned to Silver Creek to help with the medical needs of the displaced families. One evening, as Florence and Quentin sat on their porch watching the sunset, a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "When I stood on that auction block in Downeyville all those years ago, I thought my life was over," she said, her hand finding Quentin's as it always did. "I couldn't see how anything good could possibly come after such humiliation." Quentin's fingers tightened around hers. Though his hair had silvered and lines creased his face, his eyes were still as blue and clear as the day they met. "And now I know that life's darkest moments can sometimes lead to its brightest joys," Florence replied. "That day you called me priceless. You gave me more than freedom. You gave me the chance to discover my own worth." Quentin lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her fingers with the same tenderness he had shown throughout their decades together. "You were always worthy, Florence. I just had the good fortune to recognize it first." They sat in companionable silence as the stars began to appear, their lives intertwined as completely as the roots of the ancient pines that surrounded their home. From worthless to priceless, from despair to joy, from two solitary souls to the heart of a thriving family and community, their story had unfolded in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day in Downeyville, when a cowboy refused to let a woman be valued as anything less than the treasure he recognized her to be.